Hello, this is Dr. Geer, and we are in Unit 3, Chapter 4. This deals with the process of selection in the personnel process. And I would like to start on slide number 2. What I will be doing is going through these steps with you slide by slide and adding information as I see pertinent for you, in addition to what you see in the book and in the PowerPoint. And I'm going to go through quickly these steps as Rebor gives you. The first is to write the job description, to establish the selection criteria. 3, write the job vacancy announcement. 4, receive applications. 5, select the candidates to be interviewed. 6, interview the candidates. 7, check credentials, references. 8, select the best candidate. 9, implement the job offer and acceptance and notify unsuccessful candidates. I would say that Rebor puts this process, which often takes somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2 months, into a succinct succession of steps. I'm going to start on the next slide, writing the job description, job analysis, and with that I'd like to make the following comments. The job description is one that I think is somewhat, how can I say this? This is somewhat imaginative in the sense of the real world of the educational hiring process. For instance, if there is a job description, it usually has very little to do with the teaching process, but rather oftentimes revolves around some support staff, for instance, a custodian or a teacher's aide. For the teaching positions, I would pose the question, is there even a job description for it? Very seldom will you see one that anyone can agree on in terms of what the job description for a teacher is. But I would say that elementary teachers, one of the things you need to be thinking of if you're in the recruitment process for teachers at that level is to really take a look at the data, as is the case with all levels. But with elementary testing as it stands, it's usually pretty easy to identify various areas that you need to focus in on. Amongst them might be math, or a literacy person, or perhaps something even more specialized, such as a reading recovery specialist, a speech and language pathologist, something along those lines. And your data may tell you that even if you're hiring an elementary school generalist, you may be wanting to take a look at a niche in the sense of finding talent with a special expertise to help your entire program. In the middle school and secondary, the job description per se is more curricular driven. For instance, you are going to need a phys ed teacher, a 7th grade ELA teacher, or a high school special ed teacher with a science background, perhaps. So the job description, in some senses, is defined by the opening that you have. Although oftentimes data can lead you to a specialist in a certain area who might have an expertise in a particular math level that you're having difficulty with, or some other similar circumstance. I'm moving on to the next slide, which is establishing the selection criteria. Again, I think you have to base this on what your data is telling you. And again, one of the things that I would emphasize to you, that over the years in dealing with personnel hiring, I've learned that oftentimes it's as important to trust your gut or your heart as much as it is your head and your brain, in the sense of you're looking for someone who will be the leader and role model, mentor for young people. So it's very difficult sometimes to quantify that, which I kind of had this sense that that's where Rebor wanted us to do, is to make it more scientific. But I would say to you is it's really a holistic kind of impression that I think is the most successful way to hire people. And secondly, a question that needs to be hashed out early in this process is who is making the selection per se. In other words, if you have a committee involved, is a committee consensus going to be how the candidate is chosen, or will that selection be the function of administration? My advice to you is to always have the prerogative of making the ultimate choice, because as an administrator, the ultimate responsibility for the candidate's job performance will fall under your auspices. So it's important for you to feel comfortable with the hire. So if you do use a committee, which I would recommend, make sure from the beginning of the process that they understand that they are for advisory purposes only, and that you certainly will take their criteria and their advice into consideration. My experience has been that in all of the times that I ever used a committee in a hiring process, that there was no disjunction between what the committee saw and what I saw as terms of my comfort level with making a hire. Basically, what you see, others will see, and if you have a good school culture and a basic understanding of the core values of the educational mission of your school, everybody will most likely be on the same page at the end of a process. I'm going to go on to the next slide, which is writing the job vacancy announcement and advertising the position. Again, oftentimes this is a function of district office. I would advise you as a building level administrator that if there's something special that you want in an advertisement, albeit online or in a newspaper, however the medium that the job will be posted, to make sure that you have expressed your desires for that ad. Usually the person writing that will certainly appreciate any input that you can give him or her. I'm going down to the next slide, which is receiving applications. There's really two schools of thought on this. Rebor talks about a centralized situation where all applications go through district office. I would propose to you that if you are working in a very small district with few administrators, sometimes this process can work as a decentralized function. So in other words, applications and supporting material would go directly to the building principal. However, in a larger system, for instance, Horry County, there is an office already set up for that, and obviously the advantages of using a central clearinghouse for this function are obvious. A couple of items to keep in mind when dealing with applications is how are they going to be handled. I would suggest to you that databases are important components of keeping track of all this information that will be coming in, all of the things that you will require of a candidate. Transcripts, official transcripts usually is the way to go for two reasons. One, they cannot be altered, and two, it oftentimes will reflect the seriousness of the candidate's application. How will all this paper that comes in be handled? There's a whole filing issue around this, and certainly in the world of technology, scanning, etc., can be an application for handling a lot of this paper. I'm going on to the next slide, which is about selecting the candidates to be interviewed. One of the questions that I would pose to you is who screens candidates that would be interviewed? I would suggest that that should remain an administrative function if you have a committee in place. That way you can control the candidates who are coming to the committee. Furthermore, I would suggest that if you are a building level administrator, that you should have some discussions with district office personnel about how candidates will be selected and what your role as a building level administrator will be in the screening process. It can vary from district to district. An item that REBORD does not mention that I think is important in the selecting of candidates is the question of courtesy interviews. By that I mean you may have people who are working in the district as long-term substitutes, teacher aides, student teachers that are aware of the opening, and politically, if not substantially, it may make sense to offer an interview to these candidates in the sense that they have become tangentially at least a part of your culture, and you are recognizing their loyalty and or potential talent pool that you can tap that you already know about inside your building. Again, I mentioned to you previously that my recommendation is to go through a pre-screening with human resources, the superintendent, with the principal at the administrative level to pick the candidates. It's important that the principal at the building level be involved in the screening process, and oftentimes as a superintendent I would leave that screening after I had done an initial paper screen of a number of candidates up to the principal. The reason for that is that the principal at the building level is much more aware of the politics of what's happening in his or her building, who's related to whom, the whole idea around loyalty. It's also been my experience that if you do offer people an interview based on relationships, nepotism, whatever you want to call it, that oftentimes people are very satisfied that their child, their cousin, their neighbor, whomever it might be that might have gotten the interview has at least had the opportunity to get his or her foot in the door and are happy with that. I would contend that if somebody pushes you beyond that and feels that there's some reason for an entitlement for someone to have a position, that should be a red flag that signals to you that that may not be someone you want in your organization. I'm going next to the next slide around interviewing candidates, and I'd like to spend a couple minutes talking to you about questions. And REBOR spends quite a bit of time in the chapter talking about different types of questions and interview techniques and the art of questioning, group interviews, and so on. But let me share with you my experience in terms of questions, and I'm going to give you a few that were my favorites that seem to work for me in terms of gleaning good reactions from candidates. And I would say this as a precursor to those questions. One of the things that I was never too concerned with was taking a lot of notes during an interview. I really wanted to spend my time observing the candidate, reading his or her body language, and trying to get a feel for their enthusiasm, their sense of humor, those other types of characteristics that you might miss if you're too worried about taking down information in note form. Generally, you're only going to see 3, 4, 5 candidates for a teaching position. You can most likely keep his or her information and answers to questions somewhat in your head. A couple of those questions that I'd like to pose to you are as follows. First one was, tell me about the best teacher you ever had and why you think so. Who was your worst and what did you learn from that person? I always thought that that would give you a glimpse into what the candidate thought was good teaching, good basic characteristics of a good teacher, and also showed some savvy in class, whether or not they really badmouthed someone or how they couched the language around their worst teacher. The second interview question that I would often use was, tell me about a lesson that went perfect. The reason that I posed that, I was often looking to see if somebody was reflective enough about their teaching to perhaps couch that answer with the idea that they had never taught a perfect lesson, that it was something that could always be improved. And beyond that, I would often follow that up with a question about a lesson that fell short and why the teaching candidate felt that that particular lesson was not totally successful, and what he or she did to rectify that situation. Another question that I often asked was, who's your personal hero and why? Oftentimes wanted to hear what kind of values that a person would pose in terms of their role models. Why do you want to be a teacher? Pretty simple question, but you'd be surprised about how many people stumble and don't have a good idea why they want to be a teacher. Another question that I think is very open-ended and would tell me a lot about a teaching philosophy was the question of, how do students learn? Again, those are some examples of some questions that were useful for me. Obviously, over time and experience, you will craft your own. As I mentioned to you previously, I like to use these questions as an opportunity to watch a candidate's body language. And one of the things that is interesting to watch and can somewhat show you someone's teaching style is how does the candidate use a teaching portfolio? Do they use it effectively if they have one with them? Do they ignore it? Do they give it to you at the end? Oftentimes it will show you the preparation that someone has done before coming into the interview. Another couple of questions that I would pose that I think you should consider is, and I oftentimes use this with administrative interviews as well, is to give me 3 adjectives that describe your personality. And again, I think through that, by watching body language, you can get a sense of how well someone has reflected on their own character, their strengths, and their areas for growth. The other question that oftentimes comes at the end of an interview, and I would pose this to you both as an interviewer and an interviewee, and you should be very prepared for, is what questions do you have for the interview team or the interviewer? Oftentimes, this is a time where I, as an interviewer, could get a sense of the person's preparation, how well they had thought through their candidacy to our district or our school, and also it oftentimes gave me an opportunity to see if they had done any further homework. Had they asked questions of other teachers in the district? Had they visited the website? A couple of other things that I would talk about in terms of the interview process is that if you bring someone in for an interview, a former human resources administrator, assistant, superintendent told me this once, and I think it was excellent advice, is that no matter how badly the interview is going, and you know within the first several minutes that this person is not a viable candidate for the position, that just by their mere presence, he would suggest that you should give this person at least 20 to 25 minutes in the interview situation. That can be painfully eternity. But again, that leaves a good impression on the interviewee that you have taken time, you have taken interest in his or her candidacy. And lastly, I would pose to you that as a representative of the district, it's up to you to leave a good impression on the candidate, no matter how capable you think he or she is, because that person now will go out into the community and other communities and talk about your. Also be aware of legal implications of the interview situation. This would entail training interviewers of legal limitations of the interview situation. Among the things I would suggest you to make sure they know about is to train interviewers about legalities of things that are off limits, such as age, marital status, and racial and ethnic background. Oftentimes a brochure is a good tool to train interviewers, and I further would recommend that you keep a record of those on a committee for future reference. At the end of the interview process, collect and destroy notes and excess packets. That is to protect against information in a potential lawsuit. Thing to watch and can somewhat show you someone's teaching style is how does the candidate use a teaching portfolio? Do they use it effectively if they have one with them? Do they ignore it? Do they give it to you at the end? Oftentimes it will show you the preparation that someone has done before coming into the interview. Another couple of questions that I would pose that I think you should consider is, and I oftentimes use this with administrative interviews as well, is to give me 3 adjectives that describe your personality. And again, I think through that, by watching body language, you can get a sense of how well someone has reflected on their own character, their strengths, and their areas for growth. The other question that oftentimes comes at the end of an interview, and I would pose this to you both as an interviewer and an interviewee, and you should be very prepared for, is what questions do you have for the interview team or the interviewer? Oftentimes, this is a time where I, as an interviewer, could get a sense of the person's preparation, how well they had thought through their candidacy to our district or our school, and also it oftentimes gave me an opportunity to see if they had done any further homework. Had they asked questions of other teachers in the district? Had they visited the website? A couple of other things that I would talk about in terms of the interview process is that if you bring someone in for an interview, a former human resources administrator, assistant, superintendent told me this once, and I think it was excellent advice, is that no matter how badly the interview is going, and you know within the first several minutes that this person is not a viable candidate for the position, that just by their mere presence, he would suggest that you should give this person at least 20 to 25 minutes in the interview situation. That can be painfully eternity. But again, that leaves a good impression on the interviewee that you have taken time, you have taken interest in his or her candidacy. And lastly, I would pose to you that as a representative of the district, it's up to you to leave a good impression on the candidate, no matter how capable you think he or she is, because that person now will go out into the community and other communities and talk about your interview process. So always leave a good professional impression with a candidate. I'm headed to the next slide, which is checking references and credentials. One of the things that I would suggest to you beyond what you see in the PowerPoint is that oftentimes district office, and if not, I would suggest to you as a building principal to come up with a standardized form that will go into the successful candidate's file that would show that you have done, quote, due diligence, end of quote, in terms of dealing with reference checks. It's very important that you do reference checks so that you, at the very least, can show that you did this important step of the hiring process, especially in this world of litigation and sexual impropriety and all of the other things that could go along with a hire into a school district. It's important that you can show as an administrator that you did everything you could do, what would be termed reasonable, that you have done the steps of protecting the children in your area of responsibility and building your organization the way you want through doing good reference checks. As a superintendent, one of the things that I had established as a minimum for a hire was at least 3 reference checks, and those were done on a standard form, and before an offer of employment would be given, those reference checks had to be in place. One of the things that I would suggest to you is that when you call someone to do a reference check, you should approach that as you might any other interview. You want to try to uncover information that will help you make a decision beyond that which the candidate has shown you in an interview, realizing that the person is putting their best foot forward in an interview, and we all have certain areas for growth and weakness, and hopefully through the reference check you can get a good sense of the candidate's both strengths and areas for growth. A couple of things that I would suggest for you to have amongst the questions you ask in a reference check is the potential employee's attendance pattern. What was their general overall attitude towards parents, towards students, towards co-workers? And I often would pose a question of how would you classify this person's work ethic? And I think one of the litmus tests that I oftentimes would pose to someone when doing a reference check would be that the question of would you hire or rehire this person? Further, I think you have to learn to read between the lines and sometimes try to figure out perhaps hidden messages that are being sent by a reference. And amongst the most probably in-your-face example of that is if you call for a reference and someone refuses to tell you anything more than this person was employed in our organization from date X to date Y. It's usually a signal that there are issues, because if somebody was a good employee, most likely their supervisor will be willing to discuss that candidate with you. One of the things that I also would pose to you is that education is a very close community, and you have begun to develop through your cohort and through other means a network by which you can check unwritten references, that being people who would know a candidate and their work record who might not necessarily be listed on an application or in a letter of recommendation. This is an important tool for checking credentials and references, and I would suggest that you really need to use this above and beyond the references which are provided by the applicant. I'm going on to the next slide, which is the next slide deals with the principles of constructing the application form and process. And one of the things that I would say to you about this is usually this is a function of district office. A lot of this is now going online, so you need to make sure that technologically these things work in terms of people being able to submit an application online. The other thing that I would pose to you is that, and often this is not a function of the building level, but if you ever ascend into district office in these functions, is that the application itself should be checked periodically by school council to make sure that it is adhering to any of the latest court decisions and or regulations around employment.